Imagine walking into like a rented community hall in downtown Los Angeles.
Okay.
It's Friday afternoon, so it's time for the weekly congregational prayer.
Mm.
But as you step inside, the scene, well, it completely shatters the image you might see on the evening news.
Right. It's not what you'd expect.
Exactly. Up at the front, calling the adhan, the call to prayer is a woman.
Wow.
And then when the sermon begins, it's being delivered by someone who is openly part of the LGBTQ community. And the people lined up to pray, they aren't separated by a wall or a curtain. Men and women are just standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah. And it's wild because that is a scene that would be completely unrecognizable and, frankly, deeply controversial in a traditional mosque in Cairo or Riyadh.
Oh, absolutely.
But for the people in that room in LA, I mean, they aren't protesting their faith, they are practicing it.
And that is exactly where we are going today. Look, if you're listening to this right now, you already know that Islam is just a constant presence in global headlines.
Always.
But those headlines, they almost always focus on macro politics, right?
Yeah.
Borders, conflicts, that sort of thing. What we rarely get to do is actually pop open the hood and look at the engine.
Right, looking at the actual mechanics of the beliefs.
Exactly. We rarely get to look at the vibrant, intensely debated, and honestly fascinating intellectual arguments happening inside the faith today. So we are taking a massive deep dive into the world of modern reform and progressive Islam.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We're going to map out what this movement is, where it came from, and why it is causing such a massive stir globally.
But, before we dive into the mechanics of all this, we really need to establish a clear framework for our conversation. Because the ideas we are unpacking today, they touch on some of the most highly debated, deeply sensitive political and social issues of our time.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about gender equality, human rights, the legacy of colonialism, and, well, the very nature of religious authority itself.
Which means we need a disclaimer right up front, just between us and you listening.
Right.
We are not here to take sides.
Nope.
We are not endorsing, and we are not condemning any of the viewpoints we're about to discuss. Think of us strictly as your tour guides through a very complex intellectual landscape.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Our only job is to break down the arguments being made by these thinkers so you can understand the forces that are, really shaping the 21st century.
Right. We are analyzing the architecture of these ideas, not asking you to move into the building.
Exactly.
And to start, we really need to dismantle a very common misconception. Because when people hear a term like progressive Islam, the immediate assumption is that, a group of people got together in a coffee shop in the year 2005 and decided to invent a brand new religion.
Right, or at least some sort of breakaway sect, like a new denomination with a new holy book or something.
Exactly, but that is entirely false. Progressive Islam is not a new religion. It is not a separate sect.
So what is it?
It is a modern interpretive lens. It is a specific way of reading ancient sacred texts through a very specific modern ethical framework. And to really grasp this, we have to look at how diversity actually works within Islam, which, well, it operates on what we can call two distinct layers.
Okay, yes, this two-layer model completely changed how I look at this. Let's break down layer one.
Go for it.
So layer one is the historical structural stuff. If you've ever taken a world history class, you've probably heard of the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims. That is layer one.
Right. And that split goes back, 1,300 years?
Yeah, a long time.
It originated over a highly specific historical dispute regarding leadership immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century.
Over who should be in charge.
Exactly. The Shia preferred tradition maintained that leadership of the Muslim community should have remained strictly within the Prophet's bloodline and family, specifically starting with his cousin and son-in-law, Ali.
Ali ibn Abi Talib.
Right. And that belief eventually evolved into a doctrine of imams leaders who hold both spiritual and political authority, and it generated a more centralized scholarly hierarchy.
Whereas the Sunni tradition took a different route.
Yeah, the Sunni tradition, conversely, believed leadership should fall to the most qualified person chosen by the community, starting with Abu Bakr, who was a close companion of the Prophet.
Okay, so layer one is about structural lineage. It's the historical foundation you're standing on.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is the crucial part, that progressive Islam does not belong to layer one.
No, not at all.
It operates entirely on layer two.
Yeah.
And layer two is all about how you interpret the text today.
Right.
You have traditionalist, conservative, reformist, progressive, and mystical approaches. Meaning, you could be a Sunni Muslim who takes a progressive interpretive approach, or A Shia Muslim who takes a progressive interpretive approach.
Exactly. The distinction is interpretive, not institutional.
Right.
A progressive Muslim isn't introducing a new God or a new prophet or a new Qur'an.
They're using the same texts.
Yeah, they are introducing a new method of understanding the exact same theology that a traditionalist uses.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy because it really helps. It's like layer one is the hardware. Are you using a Mac or a PC?
Right.
That's your structural foundation. Are you Sunni or Shia? But layer two, that is the software running on the machine. Progressive Islam is a specific operating system.
I love that analogy.
You can install that operating system on different kinds of hardware, but once it's installed, it completely changes how the machine processes information.
That analogy works perfectly because, software isn't built in a day, and it usually has older versions that it evolved from.
Right, there's always a version 1.0.
Exactly. The progressive operating system didn't just suddenly compile itself in the digital age. If you want to find the original source code, you actually have to go back to 19th century Islamic modernism.
The 1800s, which, if you know your history, is a period of massive, traumatic upheaval for the Islamic world.
Traumatic is the exact right word. I mean, imagine the psychological shock. For centuries, the Islamic world, whether it was the Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia, or the Mughals in India, they saw themselves as the absolute center of global civilization, power, and scientific advancement.
They were the superpower.
Yes. But by the 19th century, that reality had completely collapsed. European colonial powers were aggressively carving up Muslim-majority territories.
The British were in Egypt and India. The French were in North Africa.
Right. Muslim intellectuals were staring down the barrel of European military superiority, the Industrial Revolution, and just this massive influx of new scientific discoveries.
They were looking around at their own societies and realizing they had fallen drastically behind.
Yeah.
They had to ask themselves, what went wrong? And how do we survive this?
And the intellectual response to that crisis, it's split in different directions. Some traditionalists said, we need to reject the West entirely and retreat into our classical texts.
Wall.
Yeah. But then you had a group of brilliant, deeply influential thinkers, men like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and his student Muhammad Abduh in Egypt.
Right.
They looked at the crisis and argued that the problem wasn't Islam itself. The problem was that Muslims had stopped thinking.
Wow. They argued that the Islamic world had basically fallen into a trap of blind imitation.
Yes. The Arabic term for it is taqlid, which basically means uncritically adopting the legal rulings of medieval scholars without questioning them.
Just copying and pasting the past.
Exactly. Abduh and Afghani argued that Islam could be revived, but that renewal had to come from within through reason and a return to the intellectual dynamism of the early Muslim community.
So they weren't trying to throw the religion away.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They wanted to prove that Islam was perfectly compatible with modern science, rationality, and constitutional government. They weren't trying to westernize Islam. They were trying to awaken it from a centuries-long intellectual slumber.
Okay, so they planted the seeds.
Yeah.
They essentially said, hey, we are allowed to use our brains to reinterpret our faith for the modern era. But what we call progressive Islam today, that specific umbrella term, is a much more recent development. It really started coalescing in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Right, a whole century later.
Yeah, you start seeing names like Omid Safi, Amina Wadud, Khaled Abu Il-Fadl, and Farid Isak. These are the modern developers writing the new patches for this operating system.
And they took that 19th century foundation and radically expanded it. You see, Afghani and Abduh were mostly concerned with anti-imperialism, science, and statecraft.
The big macro stuff.
Right. But the modern progressive thinkers of the 90s and 2000s pushed the conversation into much more intimate and, frankly, controversial territory. They started applying this critical thinking to gender justice, LGBTQ inclusion, pluralism, and human rights.
Okay, let's get into the actual mechanics of how this works, because this is where the rubber meets the road.
Okay.
How exactly does a progressive Muslim read a 7th century text and arrive at a 21st century human rights conclusion without just tossing the book out the window?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because they don't reject the Qur'an. They believe it is divine revelation. So what is their methodology?
It all comes down to a concept called maqasid al-sharia.
Okay, let's break that down because it's the core engine of their entire worldview.
So maqasid means objectives or purposes. So maqasid al-sharia translates to the higher objectives of Islamic law.
The higher objectives, okay.
Progressive thinkers argue that you cannot look at isolated verses or hyper-specific medieval rulings in a vacuum. You have to look at the entire sweep of the religion and ask, what is God ultimately trying to achieve with this revelation?
What's the end goal?
Right. What is the overarching goal? And classical scholars actually debated this centuries ago, and they identified 5 core objectives that the faith is meant to protect.
Which are?
Life, intellect, family, property, and human dignity or religion.
So progressives take those 5 objectives, protecting life, intellect, family, property, dignity, and they make them the ultimate non-negotiable filter for how they read the text today.
Exactly. They argue that justice and compassion are the eternal, unchangeable core of the faith. Therefore, any interpretation of a text, no matter how historically accepted it is, must serve those higher objectives.
Okay, so if a literal word-for-word reading of a verse from 7th century Arabia results in a ruling today that causes suffering, inequality, or crushes human dignity.
Yes.
The progressive argument is that the literal reading is actually violating God's overarching intent. The objective of justice basically trumps the literalism of the text.
Yes, they would say that insisting on a literal rule that creates injustice is actually a betrayal of the divine will. Because God is just, therefore God's law cannot produce manifest cruelty.
Okay, hold on. I have to play devil's advocate here because this is where the friction gets incredibly intense.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. If you prioritize the spirit of the law over the letter of the law, doesn't that just open the floodgates to cherry picking? If I'm a critic, I'm looking at this and saying, you are just taking 21st century Western liberal values, finding a few vague religious principles that kind of sort of match, slapping an Islamic label on them, and calling it a day. How is this not just making the religion say whatever you want it to say?
That is absolutely the most common and fiercest critique they face from traditionalists. The accusation is exactly that they are just reverse engineering the faith to fit into a modern liberal democracy.
Right. So how do they defend against that?
Well, the progressive defense is highly sophisticated. They don't view themselves as importing alien Western concepts at all. They argue they are actually reviving Islam's own authentic historical tradition of ijtihad.
Ijtihad, independent reasoning.
Right. Ijtihad is the process of a jurist exerting deep intellectual effort to derive a legal ruling from the foundational texts.
And this used to be really common, right?
Oh, absolutely. During the Islamic Golden Age, ijtihad was incredibly dynamic. Scholars were constantly debating, disagreeing, and adapting to new environments. But progressives argue that at a certain point in history, the religious establishment grew fearful of this dynamism.
They got protective.
Yeah, and they essentially closed the gates of ijtihad, demanding that future generations just blindly follow the older rulings. Progressives are trying to pry those gates back open.
Okay, let's ground this in reality. Because theory is great, but how does this independent reasoning actually work when they are staring at a specific verse?
A great example of this methodology comes from thinkers like Abdullah Said, who advocates for what he calls a contextualist approach.
Contextualist.
Yeah, it is a multi-step intellectual process. First, you look at a ruling in the Qur'an and you rigorously situate it in its original 7th century Arabian social context.
Okay, step 1, go back in time.
Right. You ask, what was the socioeconomic reality of Mecca and Medina at that exact moment? What specific societal ill was this ruling trying to fix?
So you treat the text as a dialogue between God and a very specific historical community.
Yes. Then the second step is to extract the eternal ethical principle behind that specific ruling.
Step 2, extract the principle.
And the third step is to figure out how to apply that eternal principle to our current reality.
Okay, wait, let's make this tangible for anyone listening. Like inheritance laws.
Oh, that's the perfect example.
Right. If you look at a literal reading of classical Islamic law based on the Quran, a daughter generally inherits half of what a son inherits.
Yes.
Now, to a modern ear, that sounds blatantly discriminatory. But how does a progressive contextualist break that down? Walk me through the steps.
Okay, they start with step 1, the 7th century context. In pre-Islamic Arabia, women were often treated as property themselves. They inherited absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
Right. So when the Quran introduced a mandate that women must inherit property, even if it was half of a man's share, it was an incredibly radical, progressive leap forward for its time. It shocked the societal norms of the 7th century.
Because suddenly, women had financial rights they never had before.
Exactly. And furthermore, you have to look at the context. In that specific patriarchal society, Men carried 100% of the financial burden for the extended family.
The men paid for everything.
Right. A woman's wealth was legally her own to keep. A man's wealth was required to be spent on his female relatives. So in that exact context, the distribution made a certain kind of socioeconomic sense.
Okay, so that's step one. We understand the 7th century. Now, step two, extracting the principle.
The progressive scholar looks at that historical intervention and says, the eternal principle here isn't the mathematical ratio of 2 to 1. The eternal principle is the financial protection and economic empowerment of women.
Oh, wow. Okay. Which brings us to step 3, applying it today.
Yes.
Because if you take that principle, empowering and protecting women financially, and apply it to the year 2026, I mean, women are CEOs. They're often the primary breadwinners. The 7th century tribal family structure just no longer exists. So applying the 2 to 1 ratio today actually creates the opposite effect.
Yeah.
It financially disadvantages women.
Precisely. The progressive argument is that if you rigidly enforce the 7th century math today, you are actively violating the eternal principle of equity that the Qur'an was trying to establish in the first place.
You're breaking the spirit of the rule to keep the letter of it.
Right. They argue that to be faithful to the trajectory of the Qur'an, you have to ensure equal inheritance today. Freezing the law in the 7th century betrays the moral arc of the text.
That is a fascinating mental model. I mean, it completely shifts the definition of what it means to be faithful to a text.
It really does.
Because for a traditionalist, faithfulness means exactly copying the action of the past. For a progressive, faithfulness means continuing the moral trajectory of the past.
Yes, which requires an immense amount of intellectual labor. I mean, you are essentially debating 1,000 years of established legal consensus.
Which naturally leads to a really practical question. If you are a progressive Muslim and you are formulating these massive paradigm-shifting arguments, where are you doing it? Because if you walk into a massive historic state-funded mosque in the Middle East and start preaching that inheritance laws need to be equalized and women should lead the prayer, you are probably going to be handed your coat and asked to leave.
You'd be lucky if that's all that happened.
Right. They don't control the traditional infrastructure.
They don't. And if you want to understand why progressives face so much friction, you have to look at who holds the power right now. If you look at traditional Sunni or Shia Islam, they are anchored by massive, centuries-old, heavily centralized institutions.
You the guys.
Right. You have places like Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which has been an epicenter of Sunni scholarship for a millennium. In the Shia world, you have the sprawling seminary networks in Qum, Iran, or Najaf, Iraq. These are institutions with deep state backing, massive endowments, and a rigid clerical hierarchy.
They are the gatekeepers. They print the textbooks, they train the imams, they issue the official fatwas. And progressive Islam has absolutely none of that.
None.
They don't have a Vatican. They don't have an Al-Azhar. So how are they surviving?
They are surviving and actually thriving by building entirely alternative, decentralized channels. The movement is largely driven by academic institutes, non-governmental organizations, and heavily through digital media.
The internet.
Yes. We are talking about podcasts, social media networks, online study groups, and feminist tafsir circles.
Wait, let's clarify tafsir really quickly for the listener.
Sure. Tafsir is the scholarly exegesis or interpretation of the Qur'an. Historically, tafsir was almost exclusively written by men.
Right.
But today, you have brilliant female scholars doing feminist tafsir, going back to the original Arabic, analyzing the grammar, and arguing that patriarchal interpretations were projected onto the text by medieval men, not by God.
Oh.
And they are sharing this research via PDFs, Substacks, and webinars.
It is the ultimate open source religion. There is an organization we have to highlight here because they perfectly illustrate this shift from traditional infrastructure to civil society.
Okay.
And that's Musawa.
Oh, Musawa is a phenomenal example. The name means equality in Arabic. They are a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. But they aren't a mosque. They are an NGO.
Right.
When they held their launch meeting in Kuala Lumpur, they didn't just bring together theologians. They brought together Human rights activists, sociologists, lawyers, and regular believers from 47 different countries.
47 countries. That kind of just blew my mind when I read it.
It's massive.
Think about the logistics of that. You have people from completely different cultures, speaking different languages, all uniting over this shared Layer 2 interpretive software.
Yes.
They're looking at family laws, things like marriage, divorce, child custody, which in many Muslim-majority countries heavily favor men based on classical interpretations. And Musawa is systematically dismantling those laws using Islamic arguments.
They are providing the intellectual ammunition for activists on the ground to go to their local governments and say, we demand family law reform, and we can prove to you that equality is actually more Islamically valid than the patriarchal laws you are enforcing.
And then you have organizations operating more at the grassroots congregational level, like MPV Muslims for progressive values.
Right.
That brings us right back to the scene we painted at the start of the deep dive.
Right.
MPV is actively creating the physical, or sometimes digital spaces, where these ideas are lived out. They are the ones hosting the inclusive prayers, where a woman or a non-binary person might deliver the Friday sermon.
And what's crucial to understand is where this decentralized network is really taking root. While there are progressive thinkers everywhere, this movement frequently finds its strongest footing and its most fertile ground in diaspora contexts.
So outside the traditional heartlands.
Right. We're talking about North America, Europe, South Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia.
Like, think about your own neighborhood. If you live in London or Toronto, Chicago, or Sydney, the Muslims you interact with every day are navigating a profound friction.
Absolutely.
They are holding ancient faith traditions in one hand, and they are living out modern democratic pluralism in the other.
They are going to a university where they study gender theory and human rights. They're working in offices alongside atheists, Christians, and Hindus.
Right.
That daily lived reality of pluralism forces a psychological and theological reckoning. When you live in a diverse democracy, you cannot easily rely on a classical legal ruling that was originally developed for a 9th century Islamic empire where Muslims held absolute political supremacy. The context is fundamentally incompatible.
So the diaspora environment practically demands this new software. But let's be honest, it takes a very specific, almost stubborn kind of psychology to want to take this on.
It really does.
I mean, you are essentially choosing to debate 1,000 years of established scholarship. You are risking alienation from conservative family members while simultaneously facing Islamophobia from the broader Western society. Who actually signs up for this?
It's a great question, and researchers have actually looked into the psychological disposition of people drawn to this movement. They created a composite subpersonality profile to describe it, and they named her Liz.
I love that they gave it a name. Like, we all know a Liz.
Right. If you are drawn to progressive Islam, you probably have a lot of Liz energy.
Right.
The profile is characterized by a high degree of independence, intellectual boldness, a tendency to challenge authority, and a deep reservoir of energy.
You have to have energy.
You do. Think about it. Reform movements, by their very nature, require you to look at an established tradition and say, I think the experts got this wrong. That requires immense intellectual self-confidence.
Yeah, if you are a person who craves absolute black and white certainty, if you want an imam to just hand you a rigid list of halal and haram, do's and don'ts, progressive Islam is going to drive you absolutely crazy.
Oh, completely.
It is a faith of constant questioning, debate, and nuance.
And because of that psychology, their entire definition of what constitutes a good Muslim or what constitutes a sin shifts dramatically away from the traditionalist view.
Unpack that. How does the concept of sin change?
Well, in more conservative circles, there is often a heavy emphasis on ritual purity and micro-behaviors. Are your clothes the exact right length? Did you perform the washing ritual before prayer in the exact correct sequence? Did you accidentally eat something with a microscopic trace of a forbidden ingredient?
Technical detail?
Right. Progressives generally view this hyperfixation on rules as what they call spiritually empty formalism. Spiritually empty formalism. That is such a piercing phrase. It's the idea of someone who perfectly memorizes the prayers in Arabic, fasts exactly to the minute during Ramadan, makes sure every inch of their clothing follows the modesty rules, but then they treat their employees terribly, they pay poverty wages, or they are emotionally abusive to their spouse.
Exactly. The progressive looks at that and says, you missed the entire point of the religion. For a progressive, human worth is tied to character, ethical transformation, and how you treat the marginalized.
Right.
Therefore, the ultimate sins aren't minor ritual infractions.
Yeah.
The massive, glaring sins are systemic.
No.
Injustice, political domination, racism, and misogyny.
Which brings us to an intellectual concept that I think is, well, it's the most fascinating part of this entire deep dive. It's an idea coined by Omen Safi, one of the leading progressive scholars, and he calls it the multiple critique.
Yes, this is where the intellectual rigor of the movement really shines, and where it becomes clear that they are not just trying to appease the West. Let me set up an analogy for this because it helps visualize it. Imagine progressive Muslims are trying to build a house, a new, inclusive, beautifully designed house of faith.
Okay.
But they are trying to build this house in the middle of an active crossfire. On one side, you have the traditional, conservative religious establishment. They are throwing rocks at the front door, yelling, "You are destroying the original blueprints. You are heretics."
Right.
But then on the other side, you have Western secularists and imperialists throwing rocks through the back window, yelling, "Why are you even building a religious house in the first place? Religion is backwards. Just become secular like us."
That is the multiple critique in action. Progressive Muslims are firing back in both directions. They look at the conservative religious establishments in the Muslim world and they offer a fierce critique. You are oppressive, you are patriarchal, you are using religion to prop up authoritarian dictatorships, and you are violating the core justices of Islam.
But they don't stop there.
No, they immediately turn around and look at the modern, secular West, and they apply the exact same standard of justice. They say, and you, the West, are imperialistic. You have a history of colonial violence in our countries. You prop up a hyper-capitalist system, what Safi calls market fundamentalism, that exploits the global South. You are also oppressive.
Wow. It is a relentlessly consistent moral standard. They refuse to give anyone a pass.
Exactly.
But man, that has to be an exhausting, lonely place to stand. You don't neatly fit into anyone's political or religious box. The conservatives think you are a Western pawn, and the Western liberals think you are clinging to a backward, patriarchal religion.
Which naturally raises the question, why endure that friction? If you are an intellectually bold, independent-minded person living in a Western democracy, and you strongly believe in human rights and gender equality, why not just throw your hands up, leave the religion entirely, and just become secular?
Yeah, why do the exhausting work of the multiple critique? What is the emotional and spiritual payoff?
The payoff is that progressive Islam offers a bridge that prevents the shattering of identity. For many people, Islam isn't just a list of rules, it is the rhythm of their soul.
Yeah.
It is the peace they find in the daily prayers. It is the community and reflection of fasting during Ramadan. It is a deep, profound belief in moral accountability before a merciful God. Progressive Islam allows individuals to maintain that spiritual heartbeat while fully integrating their conscience, their belief in democracy, and their commitment to human rights.
It resolves the terrible cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to check your brain or your feminism or your human rights advocacy at the door of the mosque. You can bring your whole self into your faith.
It demands intellectual honesty, and it rewards those who combine faith with a public conscience. But, as we've noted, demanding that kind of radical reform inevitably creates a massive collision with the other Layer 2 interpretations.
Right.
To truly understand progressive Islam, we have to look at the forces pushing back against it.
Let's pan the camera out and look at the broader spectrum of how Islam is interpreted today. We need to clearly define these other lanes so we can understand the friction. Let's start with the largest lane, traditional Sunni Islam.
So, traditional Sunni Islam is fundamentally oriented around continuity. Its authority relies heavily on the four major classical legal schools, the madhabs.
Hold on, let's stop there. We need to define madhab. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot.
Sure. A madhab is a school of jurisprudence or legal methodology. In the Sunni world, there are four main ones that survived from antiquity: the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali schools.
Okay, so they aren't different sects.
No, they aren't different sects. They are just different established traditions of how to extract laws from the text. For a traditionalist, these schools represent centuries of brilliant, vetted, scholarly consensus. You don't just bypass them.
Right.
When it comes to issues like gender roles or family law, traditionalists usually maintain the structures that these classical schools developed over the last millennium.
So they aren't against reform completely, but they believe reform has to happen incredibly slowly and strictly within the established rules of those madhabs.
Yes.
So when a traditionalist looks at a progressive who is arguing for equal inheritance based on historical context, The traditionalist sees someone arrogantly throwing away 1,000 years of legitimate, meticulous legal scholarship.
Exactly. The traditionalist says, who are you with your podcast and your sociology degree to overturn the consensus of the greatest legal minds in Islamic history?
Okay, next on the spectrum, we have Salafi or conservative Islam. This is a very different flavor from traditionalism.
It is. The term Salafi comes from the Arabic word salaf, which means ancestors or predecessors, specifically referring to the first 3 generations of Muslims who are viewed as the most pure and pious.
The original generation.
Right. The Salafi movement is driven by a desire to strip away all the cultural baggage, philosophy, and mystical practices that accumulated over the centuries and return to the absolute, unvarnished, original practice of the faith.
And their methodology relies heavily on a very literalist reading of the Qur'an and the Hadith. And actually, we haven't defined Hadith yet, and it is crucial here.
Extremely crucial. The Qur'an is believed to be the direct, literal word of God. The Hadith, on the other hand, are the recorded sayings, actions, and approvals of the Prophet Muhammad as observed by his companions and passed down through chains of narration.
So the Hadith are human accounts, which means there's an entire science dedicated to figuring out if a specific Hadith is authentic, weak, or completely fabricated.
Right, and Salafis place an immense supreme focus on authentic Hadith. If an authentic Hadith says the Prophet did something a certain way, a Salafi will strive to replicate that exactly, down to the length of their beard or how they position their hands in prayer.
Wow, extremely detailed.
Yes, and they emphasize strict gender separation and are deeply opposed to what they call bid'ah, or religious innovation.
So for a Salafi, the progressive approach isn't just arrogant. It is a dangerous, corrupting distortion of the divine word. When a progressive says, well, the 7th century context means we can change the rule today, the Salafi hears, I am destroying the pure religion of the Prophet.
That is exactly the friction point. Then, moving along the spectrum, we encounter political Islam, also known as Islamism.
This is the one that dominates the political headlines.
Yes. Political Islam views the religion not just as a personal spiritual path, but as a comprehensive political and economic system. The overarching goal is Islamic governance. They believe that the ultimate expression of the faith is to implement Islamic law at the state level.
Think of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Their famous slogan was, Islam is the solution, meaning the solution to corruption, economic stagnation, and Western imperialism is an Islamic state. This contrasts sharply with progressives. Progressives generally want a secular, democratic state that protects human rights, and they want to influence society through grassroots activism, NGOs, and civil debate, not by seizing state power and enforcing religion from the top down.
Precisely. And finally, to complete the spectrum, we have Sufism, or mystical Islam.
The mystics, the poets, think Rumi.
Exactly. Sufism is oriented inward. It is focused on the experiential knowledge of God, spiritual purification of the heart, and crushing the ego. Authority in Sufism usually rests with a spiritual master, a sheikh, who guides disciples through esoteric practices, chanting, and meditation.
What's interesting is that while Sufism and progressive Islam seem different, one is mystical, one is highly intellectual and activist, there is actually some overlap.
There really is.
A lot of progressive Muslims are deeply inspired by Sufi theology. They take that Sufi emphasis on divine love and internal purity, and they channel it outward into social justice.
But looking at this entire spectrum, the traditionalists guarding the legal schools, the Salafis guarding the literal texts, the Islamists fighting for state power, it is incredibly easy to see why progressive Islam faces a tsunami of pushback.
It's the ultimate David and Goliath intellectual battle. The critics, especially from the traditionalist and Salafi camps, constantly throw out the accusation we touched on earlier. You are just watering down the faith. You are creating Islam light to make yourselves acceptable to white Western liberals.
Yeah.
How do progressives stand their ground against that when they are sitting in that crossfire? How do they defend their theological legitimacy?
They do it by anchoring their defense in the very nature of God. They argue that the foundational, undisputed attributes of God in Islam are Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim, the most gracious, the most merciful.
Right.
God is entirely just. Therefore, the progressive argues, if an interpretation of Islamic law leads to the oppression of women, the marginalization of minorities, or the stripping of human dignity, the flaw is not in God. The flaw is in the human men who interpreted the text centuries ago.
They flipped the script on the traditionalists. They're saying, the Islam of the Prophet was inherently liberating. It challenged the oppressive power structures of its day. If your interpretation today props up oppressive power structures, you are the one misinterpreting it, not us. We are the ones actually following the prophet's revolutionary example.
It is a profound theological defense. They view their work as a rescue mission. They are trying to rescue the ethical heart of the religion from patriarchal cultures and authoritarian clerics who have encrusted it in centuries of cultural bias.
And it is vital to point out that this progressive movement isn't a monolith. They aren't all marching in lockstep. There are fierce, vibrant debates happening inside the progressive camp itself.
Absolutely. It's a family of approaches. You have the academics writing dense 500-page papers on Quranic hermeneutics. You have the frontline activists protesting in the streets. And they often disagree on how fast and how far to push boundaries.
Yeah.
There is even a robust debate over terminology.
Progressive versus liberal debate.
Yes. For many thinkers like Omid Safi, the word liberal is actually inadequate or even tainted.
Really? Why?
Well, they associate liberal Islam with a kind of passive, uncritical assimilation into Western capitalism and Islam that just wants to fit in and not make a fuss. Progressive, on the other hand, implies that edge. It implies that multiple critique.
I see.
A progressive Muslim doesn't just want a seat at the table of Western capitalism. They want to flip the table over if it's built on exploitation.
Okay, we have covered an absolute mountain of intellectual ground today. We have traced the DNA of one of the most dynamic, controversial, and fascinating movements in the modern world. Let's pull it all together and synthesize this.
Sounds good.
For you, the listener, whether you are prepping for a comparative religion class, trying to understand global geopolitics, or just deeply curious about how ancient faith collides with modernity, here is your core takeaway.
Go for it.
Progressive Islam is not a new sect. It operates on layer 2 of Islamic diversity. It is a modern, ethically driven, digitally networked method of interpreting the Qur'an and the Sunnah.
Let me quickly define Sunnah before we close it. Is the traditional portion of Muslim law based on the Prophet's words and actions.
Right.
Progressives look at the Qur'an and Sunnah, and they prioritize the overarching ethical objectives: justice, human dignity, the protection of life over rigid medieval literalism. They contextualize the text.
And they survive not by controlling state governments or ancient seminaries, but by leveraging the tools of civil society. NGOs like Musawa, academic circles, and the open source power of the internet.
Yeah.
They took the intellectual seeds planted in the 19th century by modernists reacting to colonialism, and they grew them into a 21st century framework that tackles human rights, gender equality, and pluralism head-on.
And understanding this prevents you from falling into one of the most dangerous traps of modern discourse, which is monolithic thinking. It forces you to realize that a religion of nearly 2 billion people is not a monolith. It is a vibrant, internally debated, constantly evolving spectrum.
Which leaves us with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over. Throughout human history, religious authority has almost always been physical.
Right, buildings and land.
You maintain control by holding the keys to the castle. You control the printing presses, the seminaries, the massive cathedrals, the state-funded mosques. If you held the real estate, you controlled the theology.
But look at what progressive Islam is doing. They are successfully building a global, highly influential, interconnected faith community using PDFs, podcasts, Zoom calls, and decentralized networks. They are bypassing the physical infrastructure entirely.
Which raises the ultimate question. What does the future of religious authority look like in the 21st century, when the old gatekeepers no longer control the gates? When the digital software can simply bypass the traditional hardware?
It's a massive shift.
That is something to think about the next time you scroll past a headline. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the obvious narratives, and always keep popping the hood to see how the engine actually works. We'll catch you next time.